All right, so remember that array list is a pre-made class. Okay, it's from what's called the collections class in Java. And do you remember the advantages of using an array list rather than a regular array? You guys remember the main advantage? Yeah, we can make it bigger. We can increase the size, yes. We can make it bigger or small. Well, not smaller. We don't care about making it smaller. But it grows in size as we need it. And then we can use its pre-made methods to insert things into our array list, to get things from our array list, and even to sort our array list. So we can even use a sort method that it has inside of course, array list you would think, yes, has a sort method. And when we're learning binary search, we do need our array list in order. So we need our arrays in order to search them with binary search. Okay, and we'll get to binary search, like I said, next week. All right. So array lists are created with an initial size, but it will grow. Okay. And when objects are removed, it does shrink, but we don't have to worry about it growing and shrinking. We just know that it'll always be the right size for us. So I thought we could look at the examples. Of course, there are methods in our array list. We have the add method to add things into our array list. We can add at a certain index. Remember we looked at the Java API last time for array list, and we saw all those methods. Remember that you can grab code like this online and, kind of test this code. But when you're creating a new array list, this is how we created our new array list the same way. We use our constructor. Okay. And now we can use the array list, and you can add things into your array list. Notice that they did not make it use generics. They didn't use, hey, this array list contains strings. But it's always better to use those generics. Okay? And making it type specific. But in their array list, they're inserting some strings into their array list with the add method. And remember, there's two different add methods, and when the add method had two parameters, that means stick this item, or this object, the string object, inside of our array list at index 1. So when it has two parameters, it means put it at that index. And we can use our size method to know how many items are inside of our array list. Remember, that's not the length of the array, that's the actual number of elements in our list. It's the size method. And when we want to remove things from our array list, we just say remove. We can remove by index number, or you can remove by object name. Okay? And remember that when you're removing, if you had duplicates, it will just remove the first one. And that's pretty much all you really need to know about array lists. They're pretty simple. So let's review our code. And like I said before, maybe you came in a little bit late, but if you missed last Wednesday, I did put the code up here. And here's our data that we're using. So we found this data online with some educational income data, so types of education, how much income people have made. So the data right from our Bureau of Labor Statistics. Okay. And then we made the educational income data class to hold a record. And then our educational income data test class to make an array list of those records. So grab those files if you need them. And let's review our code and our data. So remember that our data looked like this. Up here at the top were our field names, and then each row was a record that included all those field data for each of those field names for each of our records. And we had to clean up this data a little bit and get rid of the white space. We got rid of the white space for ourselves and all the extra commas. And so when we made our class to represent a record inside of our data, we just use those field names as our instance variables. So we learned how to do that. That's pretty easy. And we made them the correct data type, and we made all of these strings because of the way that our data was made. We just went ahead and made them strings. And then our last data variable, we made an integer. Alright. So then we made our constructor like how we've been doing, that takes an array of strings, and we set our instance variables to what we send it in, so it represents how we're sending it a line of text from our data that we're reading in. It sends it in this line as an array of strings. And then we split it up and put it into our instance variables. And then we made our accessors and mutators with our buttons and eclipse, and those should be pretty straightforward by now in this class. And we made our toString method using our buttons and eclipse, right? So that was all good. So remember, that's pretty much how you make your class to represent a record in it, some data that you have. And then we made our test class, and remember when we made our test class, this is when we're going to use our array list. So we created an object of type array list, and we named it myList. And we used the default constructor for an array list. And then we copied and pasted our read in file code. You know it works. We've been using it all along, and hopefully you guys are starting to understand or do understand what this code does. And then very importantly, we read in the first line from our text file, and we do nothing with it. And remember why we do that. We do that so we can read in this line here and get rid of that line. There's no way to say, hey, skip that line in your file. There's no Java method for skip a line. So what you do is you just read in that line and then don't do anything with it. Okay? And then we start our while loop. In our while loop, we're reading in until we reach the end of the file. So we read in each line one at a time. We split up that line depending on their comma. This is the important part. We made a new record using our constructor. This is an array of strings. And then to test it, we went ahead and outputted it, and then we added it into our array list using our add method. And so then we tested it, and everything seemed to work. Okay, up until this point. So we have an array list full of data. Now we need to see that array list. And the point of doing it this way was to figure out how to use array lists. So our next method that we're going to make will be a print output method, and it can just print or iterate through our array list. So when you're printing out an array list, you're printing out the contents of an array list. It's called iterating through your array list. There's actually a few different ways that you can iterate or print out the contents of an array list. Okay. In fact, I thought it was at this link. There's 5 ways to iterate through, oh, that's a loop. Oh, a Java list. So there's 5 different ways that you can iterate through a list, and a list means an array list. You can use a for loop, an advanced for loop. You can use what's called an iterator. Remember that whenever you can use a for loop, you can use a while loop as well. And then you can use the collection string. Okay, so let's look at each of these. Oops. Ooh, it's so dark. Here, I'll copy and paste these. Hold on. It's nice up close being dark, but far away, a little light. Now let's copy and paste. Now you might have noticed that when they instantiated their array list, they instantiated it like how we did. But when they declared their array list, they declared it a type of list. And a lot of times programmers will declare a type list but then instantiate it array list. And the reason that they do this is because array list actually extends or inherits from list. So the array list class is a list. Like if you go and look at the Java API for array list, and you go and look at his inheritance structure, up here he extends from abstract list. So he is a list, and an array list is a list type. And when you're instantiating or declaring it, when you're declaring these, you usually declare it the more abstract type. And the reason being is when you go and send this, like let's say you want to send this array list as a parameter to a method. A lot of methods will say, hey, I can take a list as my parameter, so that you can send it an array list or different types of lists. It makes it use what's called polymorphism. Okay, polymorphism means I have a method that takes in a list, but I can send it an array list because an array list is a list. So you usually declare them the more general type and then instantiate them the more specific type, because you can't instantiate it as a list. And that'll make more sense as you program more and more. But you just note that sometimes, a lot of times, people will declare them a list and then instantiate them array list to make it more general. All right. He adds some in with the add method. Adds some objects into his array list. And here's what we wanted to look at is how to iterate through this list. So here's with a for loop. We should be familiar with a for loop. When we're iterating through an array list with a for loop, our for loop looks the same as it would for an array. It starts at I equals 0, I less than length. And remember, size is how many elements are in an array list. I less than size, I plus plus. And then we use that get method to get each element at the index from 0 to length. That's pretty straightforward to print out an array list this way. Okay? Now here's using a for each loop. Now we can use for each loops with regular arrays as well. But the way the for each loop works is you have for, and then this is one element in your list. So if you had an array list of records, you would put record temp. If you had an array list of integers, you would put integer temp. They have an array list of strings, so they put string temp. Then you put a colon, and then you put the name of your array list or your array. And this will automatically iterate from index 0 to index length. Every element in your list will become temp. So the first time around, that's array list item index 0. Second time around, array list item index 1. Index 2 all the way to index length. You see how temp will become that array list item as you iterate through your array list. And that way is pretty easy, and it's nice to write. Okay, nice and clean. And then they have, you can iterate with an iterator. And your textbook actually goes into iterators. But if you use an iterator object, you can iterate through your array list. So every collection class, every array list has what's called an iterator object as one of their instance variables automatically. Okay? And to get a hold of that iterator object, first you make an iterator object of the type of object that your array list is holding. So iterator object, and we use the generic saying, hey, our array list is holding strings. You call that iterator whatever you want. He's just a variable. And then you use your array list method called iterator. We know it's a method. It's a lowercase letter in parentheses. But this method returns an iterator object that's connected to the array list for us. So it gives us, it's like the get method. Because we know array lists have these instance variables called an iterator. That's like get iterator. So it's saying, hey, here's my iterator. And the iterator's job is just to iterate through the array list. Just to go through the array list from index 0 to index length. Okay? So you can use a while loop. And you're using that iterator, and that iterator is an iterator object. So that iterator object has methods associated with him. And one of the iterator object is the hasNext method, and you can know what hasNext method returns. What does hasNext method return? It returns a, what kind of value? He's in the if statement, so he returns a Boolean, right? So he's returning true if there's a next element in the array list, and false if there's not a next element in the array list. So he's iterating through the array list and telling you if there's another one. And then to get that next element in the array list is the .next method. So the third way that you can iterate through an array list, and that's a very popular way to do it. Okay. Here's another way to iterate through our array list, using a while loop. Now the while loop is doing the same thing the for loop is doing. So you see you have I equals 0, I less than size, I plus plus. They just put the three parts of the for loop in three different locations. Remember when back in programming 1 you made a for loop into a while loop and a while loop into a for loop. Okay. So it's doing the same thing the for loop's doing and just using the get method, get it at index 0 to index length. And then the last way here is a less popular way, using the collection stream class. But note, for your list, in this temp, now they declared temp inside of their string. Where's getting temp here? But pretty much, I wouldn't worry about this way too much. You should know how to convert your for loop to a while loop, and that should be pretty straightforward. You should know this one, okay, the iterator one. The for loop should make complete sense, and then the for each loop, maybe you're not used to seeing it, but a lot of people do use for each loops too. Todd?
What does it say at the end? Back to
Which one?
when you declare the iterator string.
Oh, the iterator right here? It's using the method, so it's using that list class, and the list, an array list, has some instance variables already. And one of the instance variables it has is an iterator object. So we use this method called iterator to give us that iterator object, and we put it into this object right here. We're putting the reference into there. So now he's pointing, and he is the iterator. He's pointing to the array list. Should we try using that one? I think we'll use the harder one. We'll use the iterator one today. Now note that you could do it any of these ways to iterate through your array list. All of these will work, you know, the same way. My question is, why is there so many ways? Why do you think they always give you choices? Why do you think they give you choices? Well, obviously, well, not obviously, but this get method wasn't built just to be an iterator. The get method was to get something at that index. And we're just using the get method in a for loop that, you know, we know how to make for loops, and we're kind of making it into an iterator. The truly proper way to iterate through an array list would be using this iterator object. When I say proper, this is the built-in mechanism that they give you to iterate through your array list. Okay. So we can use this one today. So what we're going to do is in our test class, note that this will be in our test class because that's where we instantiated our array list. So we created our array list of objects. So this is where we're going to put the print method to print out that array list. He doesn't need to, we can just have him print it out and not return a string. It'll be a little bit less needy on our computer, right? If we don't have it return a string, use less RAM. So we'll just have him print out our array list. Now we don't need our iteration. Now instead of iterator string, our iterator is going to hold objects of what type? Educational income data type. Okay. So he's going to grab an object of type educational income data. Because remember, our array list is holding objects of type educational income data. And I think I'll just name him something smaller. A lot of times they name him I, but I might get confusing. I guess if you really wanted to, you could call him iterator. And then we need our list, our array list, to return our iterator to us. So our list we named, what did we name our list? Here it is, my list. We named our list my list. So over here we'll say my list, give us back that iterator, and he knows what an iterator or what that method does because he is a list object. And then we can use him in our while loop and use him to get the next item to print out. And then the only thing I need to do is hover over my iterator class name and make sure I get that import statement written at the top of my program. Remember, Eclipse will help us with that. If you hover over iterator and you choose the import, note what library he's in. Your iterator class is in the java.util library, right? And when something's part of the java.util library, that means that's your utility library. That's kind of like your standard library. I forgot all their guide dog stuff today, and they think it's just like fun day. It's not fun day. Okay, what was I saying? Oh yes, so your library, very important. So note that the array list is part of the util library, your iterator is part of the util library, your scanner is part of the util library. This tells you that, hey, people use these all the time. It's part of your normal utility library. Okay, these are things that programmers use all the time. Okay. So most people get that created, and it should work. Now my computer is using a Java runtime environment that's not supporting my generics. Remember, they're updating it. I mean, I'll fix it after. But you can put your generics in yours, and you won't get that red underlined in your computers, right? And if you are getting the red underline, just delete that part. It's not detrimental that we have the generics in there. It does make it safer. It makes your code break less, actually, because then it's type safe. Okay? It's always good to be type safe. Now to see this code running, we'll have to call that method, of course. So you're going to call that method in main. So in your main, you'll call your print array list method. So So use your educational income data test object we called test and call the print array or list method. Alright. And so to see him really working, make sure you comment out that system out print line, so then you don't have any other system out print lines. Put your array list system out print line, print your array list method. So then you'll know that your iterator is working and everything's working, because you'll see your objects print to your console. Now remember what this is doing. This is getting the next object. It's returning to you an object of type educational income data. He's bringing back each object in turn and putting it into that print line method. And so remember that when you're printing these, you're printing that object. It's calling that objects to string method. So for every object, this method is being called, and that's where it's getting that output. So make sure you know that's clear, that you know, hey, every time I print out an object, it's calling that objects to string method and using his instance variables and printing them to the screen. Okay. So it's a couple layers of abstraction on here. We have our array list abstraction, and then we have our underlining object abstraction. Okay, so a couple different things to think about. Did everybody get that to work? You got that to work? Excellent. Douglas?
Has next is a print the underline.
Which one?
That has next. Get that. Just read
Make sure that this guy and this guy spelled the same. And that he is declared a type iterator. Now I'm going to move on to the next part. And if you're still having an error, we'll stop in a second and we'll come around and debug. But I'm going to move on to, we need to ask it some questions and write some more methods in here. So now we have this array list of educational income data objects. And our educational income data looks like this. And I have some questions that I could tell you guys to ask. But does anyone have an idea what kind of question would you want to ask this data? What would be a smart question to ask? And do you guys understand what this data is? Hopefully you've been looking at it a little bit. Maybe we should talk about it a little bit. So this data came from our government, right? It's right here. It doesn't really have a blurb on it. I'm going to open it in Excel. So they had the year they acquired this data, and then they had like age groups. So you might have noticed that, you know, they're in order of age groups. So they're sorted first by age group, and they have 0 to 17, and then they have 18 to 64, and then 65 to 80 plus. So 65 to anything. So they had three age groups that they took this data from. The second thing that they sort their data by, so they sort it by age group first, and then they have it by male or female. Okay, so for each age group, they'll have the males first and then the females second. Okay, for every age group. And then for each of those age groups and each of those genders, they ask the person what kind of education they have. And so then the third thing that they're sorted by is educational attainment. Okay. So children under 15, obviously they have education up until they're 15 years old, that had no income, there was 0 of them. So they obviously didn't ask any children under 15 whether they had any income. So let's say the second record here, how many individuals that they surveyed were aged 0 to 17, were male, did not have a high school diploma, and did not have any income. And there were 650,889 of those. Okay, so they took a count of how many males, 0 to 17, no high school diploma, and no income. Okay, and then they said, okay, how about all males, 0 to 17, no high school diploma, with an income between $5,000 to $10,000, and there were 30,152 of those. Do you see how this data is kind of set up? So they kind of tell you which part of the population fits into these different categories for every year. Okay, so note that the 0 to 17 male, no high school diploma, no income in 2008. And then if you search down here in 2009, there's a male, 0 to 17, no high school diploma, no income, and then they have a number for that year as well. So one of the questions I thought maybe we'll ask my question first and then I'll have you guys ask a question of it. My question is, for a certain age and a certain gender and a certain educational attainment, for these, maybe compare these numbers year over year. So I'll say, hey, for a male 0 to 17, no high school diploma and no income, how many of those individuals were there each year? Right? From 2008, so this data is from 2008 to 2014. Okay, so for those, let's see, 7 years, because it's inclusive of those years. So for those 7 years, what were those numbers? How many of the population were 0 to 17, male, no education, with no income? Okay. So how would you ask our data something like that? How would you write a method for that? So let's write that one together, and then you guys can ask it a question. I'll let you guys ask whatever question you want. You just have to ask it something. Okay? So the question I thought we could ask, and you could easily change this to get different data out of ours. Or maybe what's the average? I could say, how much has it gone up over the years? What's the percentage difference between 2008 and 2014? You could ask it all these different types of questions. So at first, let's just print out the number of individuals that were, and here's where we'll give it some criteria. We'll say from 0 to 17 years old. We'll say male. That would be very easy to change it to female too. No education. So I'm just kind of looking at our data, like I said, no education. Or no, not education, no high school diploma. No high school diploma and no income. Okay. Oh, it's on that table right back there. It was a hand sanitizer dispenser. Do you see the mark on the wall where it used to be? And I think it's sitting back there, right there on that table. Yeah, right there.
Okay, we'll do something different.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's been there a while.
What time do you guys get out?
12:20. Yeah, 12:15. All right. So we'll just print out. We'll print out these numbers, and then we can think how we're going to change them. But how do we get a hold of this data? You guys should know how to get a hold of it. So print out the number of individuals that were 0 to 17, male, no high school diploma, and no income. And we're just going to print them out. We are not going to return a string, so we'll have our method be void. And I'm just going to name my method question 1. Maybe that's not the best method name, but it's easy. So the first thing I want to check is just, now there's a couple different ways that I could go about doing this, okay? But pretty much I'm going to iterate through my array list and then check these criteria. Okay? Now we've iterated through our array list once, so we can use that same code and copy and paste it. We know our iterator works, and if it didn't, we'll get it working. Alright. But here's where we're going to check our criteria, and I bet you guys already kind of figured out how to check your criteria. But let's make a temporary object to hold our next item. I think I spelled this very wrong. So what I did is I created an object of type educational income data type. I named him temp, or I can name him whatever I want. And then I used my next method from my iterator to grab that next object. Now if your iterator was not letting you use generics, using that type specific. Now, if yours probably doesn't have a red underline, right? Because it knows what type of object it is. But because I didn't have the type specifiers in here, that's why I'm getting a red underline. It doesn't know what type of object I'm returning, and it thinks that I'm being type unsafe. So if yours did not let you put the generics in here, then over here you'll have to typecast this object to type educational income data type. And do you guys see why I had to do that? Otherwise he doesn't know what type of object this next method is returning. So if you don't have red underlines, you do not have to typecast him. And that's what the generics does for us. It does it so we don't have to typecast. Alright. So now we can just use this temp object and do some if statements. Right? So we can say if our object's age, which is a string, dot equals ignores, well, we can do equals or equals ignores case. But we know we're going to use the right case. Equals, and we wanted 0 to 17. And note that I'm putting a string in there because get age is a string. Remember, we sorted it as a string. Now I can use an AND operator, or I can put another if statement underneath. So there's different ways that you can do this, but I want it 0 to 17, and what's the next one that we wanted? That he's male. The gender is male. So we can use an AND operator in here, or sometimes when I'm writing these, I'll just make another if statement underneath. We could say temp.getGender dot equals male. And remember that I'm using dot equals, so I want to put the right case and put an uppercase M. So if I look at my data, that's how it's spelled. And if, so notice it's going to go through all of these, and if any of these fail, it'll jump out of these if statements. And has no diploma. So I'll get his educational attainment, and I'll see if it equals. You guys kind of know what I'm doing here now, right? It'll equal this one, no high school diploma. Notice if I copy and paste it, I know I won't have any spelling errors. But we're pretty much saying, okay, if that's true, and this is true for that object, and the no high school diploma is true for that record or for that object. Oh, and the last one, if they have no income. So then if temp doesn't have an income, here it is, get personal income dot equals, and which personal income did we want? The no income. So no income. So if all those criteria are true and my record matches those 4 things, so his instance variable for age equals this, and his gender equals this, and his educational attainment equals this, and his income equals this, then I get to print him out. Otherwise, I do not print him out. See, I put 4 if statements in a row, but note that you could have combined these with and also. So you guys don't have to do this, but I just want to show you that you could have written it also, and hopefully you know that you could do this, with the and statement like this. You could have connected all of these with the ampersand, which is your and. And remember, your and works that they all have to be true as well. So having those 4 if statements kind of in a row, or the and statement, will do the same thing. To tell you the truth, I think this way is a little itty bitty bit more efficient, because it does make less assembly language code than having multiple if statements. Okay. But that should make sense to you. Alright. So then we need to test him. So instead of printing my array list, I'm not going to print out my array list this time around. So remember, you always have to call this method in main in order for this method to run. And my method name, I named it question 1. I was just thinking it would be nice for us to print out the year also, not just, well, I guess when we print out our temp variable, he'll print out our year. But if you were to run him, you should see this data year over year, where it matches that criteria that we gave it. Remember, it's just doing a linear search through our array list using our iterator. And we're just searching, and we didn't even search for it that great. Okay, we just said, hey, if those, we just iterated, did a linear retrieval of our array list. Said, hey, if these criteria match, go ahead and print them out. So then I could use that logic, and I could say, well, what is the average? What is the max? What is the min? But I'm not going to make you do that. Actually, it is going down. Look, it reached a peak in 2012. And then it went down to the lowest it's ever been in 2014. So it started to rise, and now it's on the downward trend, we could say. So if we were to look at this data and say something intelligent about it, we'll say next year we estimate that it'll be even lower than that if we believe in trends, right? If it's going a downward trend, we could say it'll be about this number or less. If I were to make a guess, I would say, you know, about that number or less in 2013. Or 15, sorry. What's another question that would be smart to ask our data? What do you think? How about this question? Nobody else has a question? Otherwise, I'm just going to give you my question. Huh? Oh yeah, we can do it female. That one's almost too easy though. How can you change it to female? Yes, you just changed that variable to female. How about for every year, what is the largest population count? What record or which category has the biggest population count for every year? So in other words, for all these 2008s, so all the 2008 data, there's a lot of 2008 data, all the 2008s. So for that year, 2008, and it's all the same day in 2008, so when you're comparing the strings, you can just compare this string here. But for all of those records that have 2008, what was the largest population? So which category had the most people in it for every year? And you can start with 2008 and then see if you can do it for every year. Yeah, start with 2008 because that one will actually be a lot easier than doing every year. But try 2008, so I'll even write down the question. This will be our class exercise, okay? And you can ask it more questions than what I asked it. But our question that you guys will work on is, for the year 2008, which category or record, so which line of data, that was our record, so which category has the biggest or max population? So you're going to find the max, so you'll need to iterate through your array list. And make sure that the date says this, date. And then find the max population, and whoever has the max population, print out that record. And you'll print out these data items for that record. Does that make sense? See if you can write that one, and as you do, I'm going to come around and make sure people got your first question to work. So you can name it like question 2 or something. And you guys can work together and you can help each other if you want. See if you can figure that one out. That's a good one to figure out. And let me put this on pause.